if we were to use more modern day language, we might say, in one sense, everything is atoms, but some atoms are configured in such a way that it makes it seem like they're solid. It makes it seem like they're separate and individual things, but ultimately they're all just atoms. And even we could bring that down further to see that the particles that make up the atoms might even actually be this quantum field idea. So we can, even in a very modern sense, say everything is one thing. It's just kind of manifested or takes on form in different ways that we recognize, but it's actually all connected. Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and thank you so much for joining me today. Over the last 3 weeks, we've been diving deeply into the first chapter, and we've had to work hard at uncovering a lot of new ideas. So now I want to kind of sit back and chew on this a little bit and look at how we can actually apply or think through what this might mean for us in our modern day context. And we'll begin with the first verse. And this will be the more of a literal translation, because I just haven't found anything that just really competes with more of just this straight up way of looking at this verse. It reads, Tao can Tao is not constant Tao. So if you recall in our previous lessons, Tao is a way, literally is a way. And it can be something in the sense of how I would explain how to get to the grocery store. That would be a way to get there. And the implication that the Taoists are making is that if it's a Tao that can be followed, a Tao that can Tao, then it's not the type of Tao that they're talking about. They're elevating this idea of Tao beyond the different ways that were on offer within different philosophical schools, and suggesting that all of these were ultimately more human-centric, and that what was really important as far as a way was actually at this like more cosmic level of the way of things, the way things just happen, at a point where we might talk about something like natural laws along those lines. So this first sentence is basically telling us that there are multiple ways on offer that are competing, vying for our attention, but ultimately it's suggesting that we want to be able to clear the field, to get those other competing ways aside for a moment so that we can try to observe and become more aware of what that ultimate way of things, how it is, those patterns that we're trying to understand, that way that is much more natural, that seems to be behind everything, that you don't have the option to follow. It's like gravity. It doesn't matter if you're ignorant of it. You can't not follow it. And if you try to go against it, you're not going to be able to. So if we think about this idea in our modern context, we can see that there's still many ways that are on offer. We could think about this in terms of, various religious or philosophical positions that are vying for our attention or our allegiance, or different political modalities, whether it's capitalism or socialism, or even within, our, Western American context, we have different political parties. There's all sorts of cultural norms that pull on us as well. And so one of the things that's interesting with Taoism is saying, okay, we see all these different ways that are out there that are calling for our attention, but maybe we can just kind of set that aside for a moment. We can recognize that those are all not the ultimate, that they are constructions that are, vying for our attention, and it's possible to follow them or not to follow them. But at the core, what we're trying to do is get at this idea of observing or becoming aware of what is, not what should be or what might be, but what is. This is really at the core of Taoism, is this idea of becoming just much more in tune with the nature of reality. And again, because once we do, then we can start to work to find ways to act in harmony with that instead of working against it. Because when we work against it, it's just like driving your head against the wall. You're not going to make any progress. So we need to understand the true nature of things as best we can. So this would be, I think, a profound implication of the beginning of the Daodejing that is very functional in the sense of helping us to recognize we need to become aware of all the competing ways that are telling us how we should be and try to uncover more the reality of what is. Now, ultimately, we might find many of these other competing ways valuable or things that we want to add back into the picture, but if we first clear that away, see clearly what is, that is the beginning point for where we want to start this journey. So if we move on then to the next verse, names can name no lasting name. So now we've come to a very interesting aspect of Taoism where we start to get a glimpse of kind of the suspicion about names or even about language. And it's not in the sense that we can't say anything about the Tao or how we should live or any of that. It has more to do with the fact that when we use names, when we apply a name to something, it appears to give it kind of a distinction, a definition that makes it seem like it's an individuated thing that is separate from everything else. Whereas the name is a category, a label we put on something, but that something is actually part of a much greater whole. And the danger of applying that name and thinking of that in more of an ultimate sense is that when we start to think about things as separate, we don't always recognize that what we do to one thing affects everything else. So this would be a key thing that they want us to keep in mind, is that the name is not the ultimate, it's not the constant, it never can be, it's always a label on top. But the other thing that we need to recognize is the illusion of more continuity. Another key concept within Taoism is that everything is in flux, everything is in flow, everything is constantly changing. Names seem to be not changing. They seem to be more of a constant. And so, again, it creates this illusion of stability that doesn't really exist. So it's important for us to see more of this flow, this dynamic that happens. And yes, names are very helpful for how we navigate our world, but they are not the ultimate reality. And so here we can think of, if we try to move aside the names and try to enter into more of an immediate experience of just being, this is another one of the ways that we can start to clear some of those filters that will help us to get at what is, that true nature of reality, that pattern that underlies everything that we want to seek to come in harmony with. Now they'll kind of continue this thought in the next lines, and they read, nameless, the origin of heaven and earth, naming, the mother of 10,000 things. Now, we talked quite a bit about how what's happening for when it says nameless is actually Wu Ming, which is absent name, which could very easily be translated as nameless, but it can also be reliably translated as absence names. In other words, absence names the origin of heaven and earth. So the same follows on the next line, where it's actually Yu Ming, presence or existence name. And again, that could be naming, or it can be presence names the mother of 10,000 things. And this is introducing one of those other key structural concepts of absence and presence, and how everything is kind of in one of these two states, so to speak. But we want to be careful about how far of a distinction we draw between these. We might say that they're different aspects of looking almost at the same thing. That absence, rather than being nothing, might be more appropriate to understand it as without form, and presence as with form. And so this idea of absence being the origin of heaven and earth, which is a way of saying everything, is that everything comes from this absence, this substance, and that when we think about name, mean, or presence, that what's happening is there's this differentiation, or this what seems to be different manifestations or forms that they very colorfully call the 10,000 things. So that's also associated then with the names. Those are the objects that we want to name, the categories that we use for navigating our world. But they would say there's an underlying substance or structure that actually incorporates everything. If we were to use more modern day language, we might say, in one sense, everything is atoms, but some atoms are configured in such a way that it makes it seem like they're solid. It makes it seem like they're separate and individual things, but ultimately they're all just atoms. And even we could bring that down further to see that the particles that make up the atoms might even actually be this quantum field idea. So we can, even in a very modern sense, say everything is one thing. It's just kind of manifested or takes on form in different ways that we recognize, but it's actually all connected. So this would be a key concept that they're trying to bring about here. And they're showing kind of both sides, the absence and presence, the nameless and the named, and how all these things kind of come together. The next part of this, when it talks about it then, I'm going to use Hanson's translation of these next two lines because I think they make a clearer point about what's trying to be said. Fixing on absence is to want to view enigmas. Fixing on presence is to want to view phenomenon. So other translations would have, instead of enigmas, mysteries, and instead of phenomenon, manifestations. And I like that kind of parallel as well, the mysteries versus the manifestations. And it's also this idea of want to sometimes can be also translated as desire. And so it can kind of make it seem like with desire and without desire, but we really don't want to get too off track on that, because there's not this concept within Taoism of getting rid of desire, or that desire is a bad thing. But like with most traditions that are trying to bring about the best that we can be, it's about learning to desire rightly. And so that'll be kind of the focus. But it's also key here, everything's always with this balance. And so the different perspective of fixing on absence versus fixing on presence is not like a either or one is better than the other, but we need both. We need both to see and conceive of the whole thing. And this then is what really kind of comes out in the next line. These have the same source, but different names. So again, very clearly trying to say all this one single source, and the source behaves according to particular patterns or laws, which we would say the way of things. So it's, you got this concept of Tao, we've got this concept of absence and presence, that there's this form without form that moves into with form and back again. So there's this flow back and forth between the two. But in some sense, we're, instead of three things, it's actually just one thing. We're just trying to talk about or bring out nuances of this concept to try and help us get our heads around it and how we might start to perceive our world a bit differently. So then the next part reads, call them both deep. Deep and again deep, the mystery or the gateway to all mystery. And we brought out before that this word deep here is actually the word for dark. And that in the Addiss and Lombardo translation and some others as well, I think they're trying to bring out this idea of deep in the sense of profound, because if we use dark in the sense of kind of profound, it comes across kind of strange to us, where we tend to have more of a negative connotation with dark as something that's like foreboding or mournful or lost, or just dark doesn't tend to have good qualities associated with it in our cultural context. But the problem with the translating it then as deep instead of dark, whereas it does bring about more of this concept of profundity. It's missing, I think, a key element that's being introduced here, which, even though it's not addressed directly, is implied and definitely can be seen as kind of just below the surface of most ancient Chinese philosophy. And that's the concept of yin-yang, where there's this kind of balancing act between these correlative aspects of pretty much everything. So when we talk about the yin, we're talking about the female, we're talking, well, feminine traits, not females, as well as this idea of newness or creativity, or sometimes this idea of chaos, but chaos in the sense of, unexpected new things showing up. And we can see how this is kind of associated with the feminine in the sense of like the generativity, the giving birth to even new ideas, but also new life. And then on the yang side, it tends to be bright, and it's associated with masculinity, but that also comes with this idea of control and order. And so we've got this kind of balance between control and chaos that you need both. It's not one or the other, because if it's too strictly controlled, that becomes stifling and not life affirming. And if it's too chaotic and too unpredictable, then that's also not life affirming. So it's this nice balance between the two. But what we'll see happening within the Daodejing is there's this insistence on asserting the yin, because there's this belief that the yang has become too dominant within like their cultural structures. It's become too controlling, it's become too patriarchal, it's become too hierarchical, and we need to reassert more of this previous way of looking at things in terms of creation as this generative, fascinating mystery of life, as opposed to creation or nature being something that needs to be controlled and maintained and put down, civilized. And so these kind of views are conflicting. And so the Tao Te Ching is bringing this ancient memory, this Paleolithic kind of mindset back as kind of a counterbalance to what had happened after the agricultural revolution that shaped so much of the West, not the West, the rest of the world, including ancient China. And so it's kind of a reasserting that yin to bring some of this balance back into the perspective. So lots of fascinating ideas that just emerged just in this first chapter, which is very much kind of an overture. It's a lot of detail, very concisely stated, that gives a lot of room for reflection. But it can also seem kind of at a very high level too. So we wrestle with some of these ideas, but ultimately, what we want to say is that when we're thinking about well-being, or really any kind of thing that we're trying to solve as far as a problem, is that the first step in solving any problem is to get clear on understanding of the situation. So if we think about this opening chapter, then it's essentially trying to present a way of clarifying what that situation is. What is the context that we find ourselves in? So if we want to understand, what does it mean to be truly human? How do we truly flourish? How do we thrive? Then we need to understand the context that we find ourselves in. How do we best function within this context? Well, to know that, we have to know what the context is. So they're suggesting, here's a way of understanding that context. And the way that they're trying to get to this perspective is by stripping away all of the layers that we tend to put on top of it from our culture, from our religion, from our philosophies, and saying, not what should be, but what is. Once we know what is, that'll help us to understand how to then work in harmony with what is to bring about the greatest flourishing. And that really is at the core when we're talking about then well-being. We talked in the first episode that there's three main areas that we need to deal with. There's the environmental aspect, there's the physiological aspect, and there's the psychological aspect. So part of this is really focusing on more of the psychological in the sense of the perception. One of the concepts I brought up early on is that we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And so this is helping to bring a greater coherence between who we are and how we perceive the world by trying to strip away of much of the trappings as we can to get at the root, to get at the source, to get at that underlying pattern that makes up the way life is. So I hope you've enjoyed this kind of quick overview of chapter 1 and looking at how we can take some of these concepts into more of a modern place for ourselves, and how this can be helpful for us as we start to think about our well-being and how we are in the world. I find this infinitely fascinating, the concepts that are brought up here that are still extremely relevant. And as a naturalist, I find them very congruent, but it's not required that you come from their perspective. Just seeing the different perspective helps you to see your own perspective better because of the contrast. So let's continue to explore this to see what we can learn of this ancient philosophy and where there's potential benefit for us today. If you've enjoyed this video, please like it. Please subscribe to the channel so you can get new videos when they come out. If you are interested in finding out more about what we're doing at Kinship Cafe, you can go to our website at www.kinship.cafe. And there, if you're interested, you can sign up for our email, which will give you invitations to the live presentation of this material. We have a Zoom meeting that we do on Friday mornings, and we have an in-person, if you happen to be in Southern California, that happens on Sunday mornings. So we'd love to see you at one or both of those, or if you'd like to get the email just to stay up to date with what we're doing, that would be great too. So thanks again for joining us today. Be well.